Good afternoon and a warm welcome to you all to this live launch of the database on BWC national implementation measures, which has been jointly organised by UNIDIR and VERTIC. My name's James Ravel, I'm head of the WMD and Space Security Programmes, and I'm delighted to moderate this event. If I may begin with a little bit of context before we start our panel, but the database is a searchable, publicly accessible database containing information about the national implementation measures broadly understood that have been undertaken by all states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. The database is designed to strengthen implementation of the BWC through building an understanding of what has been done around the globe to implement this important convention and to better appreciate different approaches to national implementation from around the world. Underlying here, we also hope it can support policy processes. We hope it can help support the promotion of trust, transparency and cooperation in relation to the BWC. At this point, I think it's also perhaps useful to point out what the database is not. This is not intended as a compliance assessment tool. It is certainly not intended as some sort of substitute for verification, nor are we undertaking an evaluation of BWC implementation by states, and there will be no score or ranking process at all. That is not what we are trying to do. My colleagues will elaborate more on some of the aspects of what we are trying to do shortly. Before I wrap up, a couple of points from me before I wrap up and hand over to our panel. First, we really want this project to be collaborative. So as with other digital tools that UNIDIR has developed, we're looking forward to developing the database with input from states parties, so from many of you gathered in the room. So as we move forward, I'd like to thank those that have already engaged on development of country profiles, and we look forward to working with others as we move and proceed to go through more countries. Second point is that this is a big, ambitious project. And so far, it is a work in progress which will take years to complete. For the purposes of the launch, we have a small number of cases which we want to use to illustrate what the database will be able to do. We also have 14 more cases which are currently under review as part of a collaborative process of reaching out to states to work on the development of their profiles to make sure they present an accurate reflection of a country's national implementation. We are very much aware that we have a long way to go with the project, but we're looking forward to taking the challenge and bringing this all together. And my third point before handing over to the panel is that I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our funders from the US Department of State for their support in the development of this project. It's very much appreciated, so thank you. So turning to the panel now, today we're going to present some of the methods applied in the database and the data collection process. We're also going to provide a live demonstration of the site, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the next steps for the project. After that, we'll also leave plenty of time to address any questions, comments, queries you may have. And we'd invite both those of you online. If you'd like to reach out to us, please use the Q&A function. Of course, if you're here in person, please raise your flag or your hand and we'll offer you the floor. With that, perhaps I can now turn and introduce my colleagues who will be presenting the database. First, on my left is Mr. Thomas Brown. Is a legal officer for VERTIC's National Implementation Measures Programme. He works with states on implementing their international legal obligations related to biological, chemical and nuclear weapons and materials. To my right, Ms. Clarice Betheret is a researcher in the WMD programme at UNIDIR. Her expertise includes international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and she's working on the national implementation project with us. Also on my right is Ms. Louison Mazot, who is an associate researcher with the WMD programme. She has a background in political science and international security and is also part of our team and has a growing interest in the topic of cyber biosecurity related issues. Then also on my right, I'm joined by Yaroslav Krasny, who is a researcher with the WMD programme. He's focused on national implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention, and his expertise includes international law and its application to WMD-related agreements. Also joining me to provide some closing remarks, I'm delighted to have to my left Larry McFall, who is VERTIC's Acting Executive Director, and on the far left is my colleague from UNIDIR, Maria Garza Maceda, who is coordinating this project. So without further ado, I'd now like to turn to Clarice, who is going to give us an introduction to the database, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie, and hello, everybody. So to start with the presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview on the logic and methods behind the database, and then my colleagues will show you how it looks on the webpage. So what information is available? The database combines laws, regulation, and other measures for BWC implementations undertaken by state parties. To show how we organize the information, I will draw on a country profile, so the Bahamas, purely for illustrative purposes. As we complete the database, all state parties of the BWC will have a country profile. The profiles provide consolidated information on measures taken by each state parties based on a set of categories of measures and related topics developed for the purposes of the database. In addition to general information about each state party on the top of the screen, we'll have data for each of the following categories, and within each of these categories, we'll have sub-questions. So you have prohibition, export, import, and other transfer control, biosafety and biosecurity, oversight of life science dual-use research, governmental organization for administering and enforcing BWC implementation, UN Security Council Resolution 1540, national reports, BWC working papers, BWC confidence building measures, and assistance and cooperation offers as related to Article 10 of the BWC. So the list of categories and topics or questions within each category has been developed from the wider literature and policy material on this topic, and solely for the purposes of this database. The glossary section provides an explanation of each of the category and sub-question, and will also provide definition on the frequently used terms. To reiterate, this definition and explanation have been developed for the purposes of this database and have no official status. Another key feature of this database is the additional resources. So this section of the database will include links to the text of the BWC, official BWC portals, and other online tools and database that can be of interest to the audience. So perhaps I can talk through the process of data collection. So UNIDIR and VERTIC researchers can collect, review, and translate data in multiple languages. Moreover, we have established a clear data collection protocol process to ensure clarity and consistency at all stages. And to collect data and compile information, we have developed a survey template which reflects the categories discussed earlier. When collecting data, we focus primarily on publicly available sources and official sources, from state parties, such as from official gazette or governmental websites. We also implement an internal cross-review of completed profiles. Finally, we provide an opportunity to each state to review their information through outreach over email or in meetings in person or online. We will make every effort to make sure that the states engage in this process and work to make sure this is an accurate reflection. Thank you, and over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Clarice. A couple of points to reiterate there. Firstly, the definitions and the methodology that we have developed are intended for the purposes of the database, and obviously the definitions have no official status. The second point is that when we look at the scope of national implementation measures here, I think it's very important to take a broad approach to this. So we include things like CBMs, like oversight tools, as well as offers under Article 10 in relation to international cooperation. And we take this broad approach primarily because it helps us future-proof the database as far as possible, so there is a logic to that. I should also add an oversight on my part. I forgot to mention that we will share a link to the website. We thought we would do this after the event, though, so people actually pay attention to what we have to say rather than going and checking their profile on the database. But we will share that with you in due course. So with that, perhaps I can now turn to my colleagues with some trepidation as we turn to the live launch. If you could perhaps give my colleagues a little bit of time as we transfer over from PowerPoint to the live launch. And over to you, Yaroslav and Thomas. The floor and screen are yours.
Thank you, Jamie, and good afternoon. And now I would like to introduce the database and some of its functions, namely the homepage, filters, and country profiles. When you first enter the website, you get a disclaimer. There is a couple of things worth mentioning. First, the map is taken from the UN Geospatial Service, and that we will update it when a new version is released. Second, the database is a work in progress. We are launching with a diverse and geographically representative number of countries across the BWC regional groups. And we will continue to add profiles of state parties in the coming year until we complete the database. We will also continue to add multilingual translations of the profiles. So, this is the homepage. The design may be familiar to those who have used the Cyber Policy portal. But additionally, it includes an interactive map as well as links to, as well as links to information about the database in the About section, an additional resources section, including the text of the BWC, VERTIC, and UNIDIR resources, and so on, and a glossary of key terms. As in this example with the United States, if you hover over the mouse on the map, if you hover over with the mouse on the map, it will show basic country info. And you can click directly on it to enter the state country profile. If you do not want to look for a particular country on the map, the homepage also features a menu on the top left. You can click on the states to display a list of countries. Search and select desired state party to go to their country profile. You can also click on measures if you prefer to view the information by category rather than by state. The measures function allows you to visualize states on the map according to specific measures regarding, for instance, prohibitions, export and import requirements, and so on. When we go to a country profile, and I am showing Poland purely for illustrative purposes, each standardized profile will first contain a section summarizing the country profile, including the official country name, geographical region, BWC group, and date of ratification or accession. In each profile below, we can find detailed information on the categories of national implementation of the BWC mentioned by Clarice, such as prohibitions, export, import, and transfer controls, biosafety and biosecurity, and so on. Let's now explore what one category looks like. In this example, the prohibitions category. As you can see above in the title, a detail of the glossary's working definition of each category can be displayed by hovering over the information icon next to the title for further clarity. Regarding the content itself, for each category, we have a short factual paragraph summarizing information about how that country has implemented the category at the top. Further details for each category show when clicking on the details icon. This is the type of details that are provided under the prohibitions category. For example, if a country has included a definition of biological weapons in its legislation, we would display where this can be found, in the legislative measure. Using another illustrative example for biosafety and biosecurity, you can see on the right how the database identifies the different statuses for each subcategory. White check on green background means yes, there is evidence of laws, regulations, or other measures on the topic. Other categories include no, meaning there is no evidence of laws, regulations, or other measures on the topic. And finally, in progress, meaning there is evidence that legislation on the topic has been presented to the appropriate legislative body. Another feature of country profiles is source material. Let me just go back to our example. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. In each category, you can click on the Resources tab to display the database of documents and relevant links. Resources are mainly documents, laws, regulations, but there can also be links if the information is contained in a website and there is no document available. Again, those of you familiar with the Cyber Policy Portal will be familiar with this approach. For each resource, you will find basic information and description, link to download the PDF, link to download translated versions if available, the official link to the website from where the document was obtained. In this example, we are showing Poland purely for illustrative purposes. In the prohibitions category, you can, for instance, find the Polish Penal Code or the Act of 19 August 2011 on the transport of dangerous goods, both available to download in the Polish language. English translations of relevant materials in all UN languages will be added soon. To close the presentation of the country profiles, it is worth highlighting two functionalities. First, the option to suggest an update. In case you are browsing the profile and find something is inaccurate or outdated, please contact us to make any suggestions. We will continue to scan for updates ourselves, but we welcome your direct input as well. Second, the ability to export the country profile as a PDF file. I will now pass the word to my colleague Thomas from VERTIC, who will introduce additional functions of the database.
Thank you, Jaroslav, and good afternoon, everybody. So the second feature that we'd like to present today is the comparison tool. This allows users to look at the different approaches and tools for Biological Weapons Convention implementation. This feature allows users to view up to 5 countries simultaneously in a side-by-side view. So by clicking on Add Country on the right of the screen, you can search or choose the countries of interest from the drop-down menu. So I'm going to provide an example today just for ease of reference. So we're going to look at the example of Japan and the United States of America. And if you click on Compare, you can see a side-by-side view of the basic information. As you scroll down, you can see that the names of the countries remain on the top of the screen for ease of reference, and the categories are displayed below. So for each category, you can click on the summary to see both countries' summaries come up as a pop-up. Here's the summary for Japan and the United States of America. You can also click on the Details tab. This will display below the details of that category of each country profile side by side. Now, as you can see, by comparison, we mean showing the information side by side, but not providing our own analysis of that comparison. Finally, by clicking on the Resources button, you can access the relevant documents by selecting the tab for each country. All of the relevant resources for each country are therefore displayed here. As I said before, you can add up to 5 countries using this tool and the side-by-side view of their details. Another thing to highlight in relation to this tool is you can also export the country data as a PDF in a similar way to you can for the individual country profiles. Now, the third feature that we wanted to highlight today is the search functionality, which can be found here on the top of the screen. This allows users to search the content of the site, so the country profiles, and to text search the content of the resources, the documents, and the PDFs. For illustrative purposes now, I will use the example of the user searching for biosecurity code of conduct. There we go. As you can see, this search will bring up relevant resources and country profile sections. The reset button will then clear the search to allow you to go for a new search. The fourth feature of the database is its multilingual character. So the website is multilingual and available in all UN languages by selecting from a menu on the top right. Currently, all profiles have English versions, and if the country's official language is one of the official UN languages, we have included that one as well. All of the content will be translated and made available over time in all UN languages. So I'll go back to the map and just provide a quick example of what this will look like. If we use Poland again, you can see here the English version website, the country profile here in French, and in Spanish. And the final thing we wanted to tell you today is that the database is available both as desktop and also as mobile versions. So all of the functionality we've displayed today will also be available on your mobile. Thank you very much, and I will now hand back to Jamie.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Yaroslav. I suggest now we talk a little bit about future steps, but I have to say it's all quite good to be able to breathe a sigh of relief as the technology and the links actually work, which is always a sort of stress bit when you're about to do this sort of thing. So thank you both. But as we do transfer back over to the PowerPoint slides, perhaps I can introduce my colleagues. So Lucien now will talk about future steps and how we'll be talking to you moving forward, and then we'll get into some questions. But first, Lucien, the floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamie and Yaroslav and Thomas for the demonstration. So as with other digital tools, the database will benefit from your inputs and updates. To do this, we encourage users to provide feedback on its content. This can be done when the UNIDIR and VERTIC team conduct outreach to state representatives, as explained by my colleague. There is also a suggest and update functionality in the country profile or contact page on the website, so we encourage you to use it. Finally, a contact email, which you can see on this slide, has also been created. This would allow stakeholders to directly reach out to researchers at any point in time, and we commit to replying to your requests within 24 hours. Now, next slide, just to wrap up on our side. Thank you. We would like to touch upon a few points regarding the progress of the project so far and the future. So UNIDIR and VERTIC have been working since last year on the portal. The process has included recruiting dedicated project staff, database design and development activities with UNICC. We also worked on the design and refinement of the data collection protocol and data collection survey. And we started research activities, outreach, and of course, exchanges with states. We also conducted beta testing with a selected group of experts, implementing their comments and continue to welcome any suggestions. So UNIDIR and VERTIC teams are undertaking a systematic process of collecting data on state measures, as pointed out earlier, but we also want to work on this collaboratively with state parties, and we'll be in touch with representatives of all BWC state parties at some point in the near future. We thank state parties which have already or are in the process of providing feedback on their country profiles. As of today, we have a small set of country profiles that have been published with translation to all official UN languages in progress, but we have many more which are with states, some of whom have asked for additional time to review the text over the holidays. In the future, though, we will look to apply a 2 weeks time frame for feedback. And as for the next steps, we aim to complete the database in late 2024, incorporating about 6 to 8 country profiles per month across regional groups, as well as expanding the number of translated country profiles. After that, the team will work on updating each state profile on the database, taking into account changes in legislation and regulations across the globe. We hope this will ensure the sustainability and relevance of the portal. Thank you, and over to you, James.
Okay, thank you, Lausanne. I'd echo that point again. I mean, we do want this to be a collaborative process. So we do want to work with you in the development of the profiles to make sure they're accurate. At the same time, as my colleague pointed out, we will need to be a little bit strict once the holidays finish in terms of imposing deadlines for that. But of course, states can update the profiles at any point or make suggestions for updates at any point. So it will be an ongoing process, and we are aware of that. I hope that served as a good overview that allows you a little bit of a better idea about the database, what we're trying to do. Now we're really keen to hear your questions, comments, and any sort of thoughts on this. So once again, to reiterate, if you're online, then we do welcome submission through the Q&A function in the WebEx tool. But here, if there are any of you who'd like to take the floor, please do raise your hand or your flag, and then we can give you the floor. Okay, I can see Richard and Andre, so perhaps I can start with Richard Guthrie and then turn to you, Andre.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I've got 2 questions on sort of details. The first is your data collection. You were making comments about official sources, and I think it's very valuable to make sure there are official sources. But I've found many times that government websites and government information isn't always up to date, and quite often you can get information from other sources that have been provided by the government, such as the 1514 report. Or one example I can think of is I struggled for a long time to find the Indian legislation, then found that they'd submitted it as a document to the Security Council in preparation for a debate. So there's just, how spread is that official sources? Because I would regard an Indian paper to the Security Council as an official source from India. And then the second is on your comparisons and on the provisions. One of the things that I find when trying to look at countries' implementation is understanding the dates often that something is introduced. And I'll give an example just from the UK. The original biological weapons legislation in the UK was passed almost exactly 50 years ago. If it was passed today, legislative practices had changed and there'd be more detail and there'd be other bits that would have been included. And so when looking at comparisons of a country, that would also be useful. I don't know if you had included it, it's hard to read from here, the dates of introduction of some of those provisions. Because obviously if you're looking at different provisions, one is 20 years old and one is 5 years old, it might not be there was a sort of political difference for doing that. It may simply be that practice has evolved. And my personal view is that this sort of database is really useful to learn the lessons learned from other people. So to understand how practice has evolved, I think would be very valuable. So if you conclude that would be very useful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Perhaps I can provide a couple of points, then I'll open it out to any panelists that want to take that. And just in terms of official documentation, we are seeking to actually try to find original primary sources from states, and I think there is a reason for doing that. We want to have those official documents. But of course, that doesn't preclude triangulating our findings using things like 1540, and there are a range of other sources which we can also use to augment our findings. So there is a series of steps, but I think the original source documents, I think as far as possible, are particularly important in making sure we have those texts, I think, for the database. On your question about dates, I think for a lot of the legislation, we go for the dates that are on the documents themselves, and then we'd want to make sure they're updated as things proceed. But perhaps I can offer the floor to my colleagues if they want to raise that, or to address either of those points. If not, perhaps we can come back if you want to follow up, Richard, but can I turn to my colleague first and then others? Does anybody else wish to take the floor? See Lejeune and Andre, so perhaps we can take two questions. Andre.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks for all the panelists. And I just have to say it's a gargantuan undertaking to compile documents from all of the BWC member states, translate them, at least the executive summaries. So my question would be, how do you went about this? Because implementation of BWC can be many things. The laws are kind of understandable, but then if you go into regulations, how deep did you go, and where do you decide to cut off? Because if you're talking about some of the most countries who has a lot of biological activities, like they can have regulations. You can spend all those years just looking through one country. How did you make this cutoff? Thank you.
Does anybody else want to take that particular question? Okay. Oh, sorry. If we take Lejeune as well, and then we can.
Yes, I think this is a very, very useful database for people to track down the documentary and also the history of the BWC issues. My question is, as my center and other people do the education, what's the functions of the thought you have for the civil society, for the younger generation, what you can do something for them. And probably we would like to, collaborating with you to do some other project to make some comments, not officially or whatever, from our point of view, to provide the education purpose. That would expand the projects much useful and broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Lejeune. Does anybody want to take those at all as one? Yeah. Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so this is just a kind of general point that I think responds to a couple of questions, but a key part of this process is the engagement with the countries themselves. So when we send the draft profiles to countries, I think that's a good opportunity for if there's any new legislation, for example, any amendments, we can be pointed to that as an official data. So we want this to be a very collaborative database. I think that will help us to ensure that it is up to date as soon as possible, as much as possible. But also by including the links and the documents, I think all the information relevant should be there so that users will be able to see when the law was passed, for example, any amendments to it, and we will seek to update this database as we continue to do the research.
Thank you, Thomas. Did anybody else want to take any of those questions? No. Lucy.
Perhaps, thanks for your questions. On Andre's question, what are we really considering and how we go about including or not some regulations? I think the key word here for me is interaction, because within our team, when we have doubts or complex discussions or thoughts about whether this would be relevant for the database, we often meet and discuss those things in addition to the discussion that we will have with the states. And yeah, I found this discussion much useful because sometimes it's really context specific and you need another pair of eyes to have a look at that.
Thanks. Yes, I'd echo that point. I mean, in setting this out, we wanted to be able to go quite broad in terms of the areas we were looking at. And we've developed both the sort of glossary and the definitions of measures, as well as the data collection protocol, so it can be fairly consistent. But as Lewis said, there's a degree of context specificity in this sort of thing. So some countries will do things very differently. And perhaps if I could respond to Lejeune's point as well, I mean, We're not going to be doing an analysis or an evaluation of codes or education or any of those sorts of things, but what it would provide is a repository, a source of material for people that are interested in developing codes of conduct, education, or looking at biorisk practices in various different countries or institutions. We'll have it there. So I think in terms of providing that resource, so we can keep all that together, I think that in and of itself would be extremely useful and perhaps something that might be useful for your project and those of others as well, Lucian. Yeah. Any other questions? Does anybody wish to take the floor? China, please.
Thank you very much. It's really a very interesting launch, and thank you very much for all your team to do the very important and very valuable work. I think the BWC, we don't have an institution and we don't have a what kind of a legally binding negotiation and on the including the verification, things like that. But your work has filled the blank to some extent, so it will be very useful for member states to see what's happening with other states. I have small questions, 3 small questions. First, actually, it's mainly with regard to your column. I heard that you have 3, or maybe there are actually CBM and the oversight tools like legislation and regulations, and also the Article 10. First on CBM, I think until now there are some CBMs are publicized, and there are some are not publicized. And in that column, what kind of language or you will use, like saying that this country does not publicize, or it has no CBM at all, or something like that. And on the oversight tools, I fully understand that it is out of very good-hearted tension that you would like to collaborate with member states, ask them to cooperate with you to confirm the source and confirm all the data. But we know the reality is that sometimes maybe you lose contact of somebody, sometimes you just don't receive any feedback. And how we reflect that? Like in our country, we'll have, maybe if I take this question back, we'll have a long process, procedure things, and to maybe every stakeholder have to have some look on it and things like that, and how will you reflect that? And the third, on the Article 10, because I didn't hear much when you brief and give the introduction, I don't know how this column would look like. Like my country, we have host seminars, and we have put some of our information to the database of the Article 10, and maybe you can find some public sources and to put it in that column. But like other countries, we have heard from the big room that they lack this and that, and because of or the reasons of export control or sanctions or unilateral things like that. So how will you reflect this part? The basic source maybe you can get from the working papers, but it's really so loose and so scattered, and I don't know how this column can be looked balanced or factual. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jiang, for your questions. My colleagues may wish to take some of those, but perhaps I can briefly provide some responses to those. So just on the issue of CBMs, and it kind of links to a wider point to make. I mean, we are only using publicly available information. So if CBMs are not published, we would not put them up there. We would reference as to whether they've been, we have language which we have agreed, so we can be fairly consistent in saying country X has submitted CBMs on X years or for X period, and then language indicating whether or not they've been made public, which is all entirely factual, and it draws from the ISU CBM platform which has been developed. Just on the oversight, I mean, we are aware there will be delays and it takes time, and some countries will want to go through a process with reviewing this. I think that's my colleagues referred to the update function. I think that is really important. So if there are changes or things that we welcome suggestions for updates, so we can do that. And just on the Article 10, I think for that specific element, what we're looking at is offers of assistance within the database, at least to start with. I think Article 10 is clearly an extremely important component of the Biological Weapons Convention, and we thought it was something that should be reflected. So we have that as a means to kind of bound it within that category, but that doesn't preclude referring to activities, initiatives, and projects been undertaken or particular regulatory measures undertaken in other areas of the database, so on biosecurity or biosafety or oversight. If there are regional initiatives or things which are going on, we can weave those in within the structure as long as we can fits within the data collection protocol. So there's a couple of points from me. Does anybody else wish to follow up on that? So conscious I'm doing a lot of speaking. No? Okay. If not, any... Tancredi, oh, sorry. Apologies. Tancredi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. No problem. I know that I'm just out of sight, so it's okay. Thank you very much, and thank you again for this brilliant initiative, very useful. And well, we will try to do our best to cooperate with you and to keep the portal updated, the database updated. And I have a couple of questions. Well, one, apologies because I was a bit late. Maybe you've talked already about that, but my question is how you think to capture the regional dimensions of these implementation measures where appropriate, and definitely in my region this is appropriate. And I'm thinking, for example, of all the activities that we do with the European Union. I don't know if you have a profile for the European Union, for example, but in our case it's very relevant. It could be the same also in other area. I'm sure that it is, for example, in Asia, but well, I might not have the entire spectrum of activities, but I'm quite sure that there are regional organizations that have something to say on that. So, well, one idea could be to have a separate profile, but also to integrate this information in international profiles. I don't know if you have already thought about this. Otherwise, I will recommend to do it for another version. And well, the other question, or more of a comment, really builds on what my Chinese colleague said before me. I agree. It's completely, it's totally important, and as you said, Jamie, it's a specific dimension of the BWC to keep into consideration cooperation activities, to have some more information on the Article 10 projects. Also, if possible, beyond the BWC, because I believe there is a lot happening outside that not necessarily is covered by the BWC, but is relevant for the BWC. So, well, we might work together on that and try to find the best way to capture also those informations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tancredi, for your questions. Does anybody want to take any of those to start with? So, Thomas, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. I think just on a kind of basic point in relation to your first question and the regional dimension, a lot of EU we do not have a separate profile for the European Union. However, insofar as EU legislation and legal measures are directly relevant, those are included in relevant profiles. So it's something that has been included, and the national implementing legislation for perhaps European legislation. But I think the kind of regional perspective is something that's very important, and we are kind of trying to take that into consideration as we collect data for the database.
Thank you, Thomas. I think I'd echo that point as well. I think on the point on Article 10, I think to begin this, we need some way of bounding it, some way which is fits and we can do consistently across all states. That doesn't preclude potentially changing things and using other elements of this, where I think we can point to the number of international cooperative activities that are taking place around the world related to the convention. Any other comments? Anybody else wish to take the floor? Chris, please.
Thanks, Chris Park from the U.S. I just wanted to respond to the suggestion from Mr. Tancredi. I think there is a challenge, you're right, with Article 10, that the database certainly doesn't capture the full scope of international cooperation by any measure. But on the other hand, if you look at the Article 10 reports that have been submitted, number one, very few countries have actually bothered. And number two, they are wildly disparate in how they treat the subject. There has been some discussion of the idea of developing a format for Article 10 reports with the idea that that would facilitate matters. If that happens, then it would become, I think, much easier to incorporate those elements. I think there would still be debates. I think there will always be debates about the full scope of Article 10. You know, do you count overseas direct investment? Do you count activities that are not done by government per se, but by universities? Do you count things like administrative appeal processes for denied licenses, which I think are absolutely valid. They are a measure to try to facilitate exchange. So I think I think they've struggled with an interesting problem here. Mine would have been to run away screaming from the problem. So I give you credit. But as we move forward in the BWC itself, that might actually help the database in future, although it's supposed to be the other way around.
Thanks, Chris. Does anybody else wish to take the floor? Otherwise, we have a question come in online about plans to expand to signatory states or non-states parties. Our focus at the moment will be to begin and to work on going through 185 now BWC states parties, which is our core focus, which gives us more than enough to do for the foreseeable future. So with your indulgence, if you'll have to wait a little bit longer to move on to signatories and non-states parties for the time being. That should address the question online. I don't think there's any others, but the floor is open if anybody else wishes to add any questions or any further comments. I should add as well, my colleagues have been manning BWC implementation database booths, which are located around the Palais. So there'll be, if you see people behind a unit or in front of a UNIDIR banner, hopefully not behind it, but in front of a UNIDIR banner, then please do feel free to go and talk to them. So if you have further questions, we're always willing, eager to hear from you as we move forward with this. There's nothing else, and I can't see anything else online. Maria, there's nothing else? Okay. If not, I shall now turn to my colleague Larry to provide some closing remarks. And Larry, the floor and screen are yours, sir.
Thank you, and thank you very much to UNIDIR and the VERTIC team for the demo. It's great to see this tool come live after many months of hard work on BWC, substantive BWC implementation research, as well as very regular technical discussions on the database architecture, functions, and interface. We're very pleased to have been able to discuss it with you today. VERTIC has been supporting efforts to strengthen BWC implementation for a long time, and we're delighted to be part of this important project with our UNIDIR colleagues. We've been working with states as well as international and regional partners for a number of years on the national implementation of BWC by providing legal support to analyse and draft BWC implementing legislation and developing supporting tools to do so. One of the tools was our own BWC legislation database, which has been used over the years to inform research, analysis and assistance on BWC implementation. But developing a much more advanced and expanded version with multiple functionalities, as you've seen today, was needed. And we're very pleased to be doing so in partnership with UNIDIR. We believe that the database, as you've seen it today, will be a very useful tool in sharing experiences about BWC national implementation and informing the development of BWC implementing legislation by providing examples of different possible approaches. And in fact, we're often asked during our drafting workshops with states about drafting approaches, about country examples of laws and regulations during our missions in order to strengthen such legislation. It's certainly going to be helpful to continue to use this database in that context into the future. In addition, the database could help identify areas requiring strengthening and inform potential partnerships to further develop and amend legislation and other implementing measures for the Convention. As was noted by my colleagues, the database is a work in progress. There's lots to do, and there'll be lots to do in the future. And the team will continue to support the refinement and the population of the tool. So we very much encourage your participation as we work through this to provide feedback and to help ensure that the information is as accurate and up to date as possible at all times. We therefore look forward to future engagement with you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Larry. And unless there are any further questions, I suggest we perhaps can wrap up now. But before we do close, we shall unveil the database, and there are so it should be available now to you through a QR code or make the links for those of you online. One thing I'd like to ask as well, if I can encourage you all to fill in a feedback form for our events. It does help us move forward, progress and advance with these. So if you could take a couple of minutes, that'd be very useful. We have a link here on the screen. And from my side, I think, yeah, you should now have access to the URL for the database, so please scan the QR code as well. And as I said, my colleague Shizuka is distributing flyers as well. As with other UNIDIR portals and digital tools, and indeed much of the work that we do, we rely on your involvement, national delegates, experts, stakeholders, to be able to support our work and to be able to develop this and take it further forward. So please do reach out, please do keep in touch, particularly as we move forward and develop profiles. We look forward to working with you on these as well. I'd just like to take this opportunity once again to thank our partners at VERTIC, our colleagues from UNICC who have been working on the development, of course our funders from the US State Department, and thank you all, and then of course all of you for joining, for participating online and in person at this meeting. As I said before, there will be people in booths around the BWC meeting, so please don't hesitate to reach out and get in touch with us, and I wish you every success for the rest of your meeting. Thank you.